Okay, so this presentation is being recorded. Welcome to Navigating the Virtual Interview. My name is Sandy Oman, and I'm joined by my colleagues Valerie Mandel and Ryan Mazon. And we are going to talk today about navigating the virtual interview. I'm glad you all were able to join us today, and hopefully we'll cover all of your questions that on how to best succeed in a virtual interview environment. However, if you have questions as we go along, the feel free to put them in the chat box and we will get to them. And there'll be another time at the end where we can all ask more questions as well. So we're going to go ahead and move forward with navigating the virtual interview. What is a virtual interview? Well, I would say if you asked us a couple months ago, it would be slightly different than the answer we would give today. Still the same as far as a virtual interview is where you are interviewing with somebody, but you are not in the same location as them. You are remote or virtual. But I would say today the reasons for doing a virtual interview might be slightly different, whereas in the past, face-to-face interviewing, on-site interviewing, even phone interviewing were other options that the company could utilize, where today a virtual interview is what most companies are doing. They're not doing the face-to-face interviews because of everything that's going on in today's environment. That could obviously change as we move forward, but you still want to be able to be prepared for how to be successful in the virtual environment. Virtual interviewing can be done with different technologies. It can be also pre-recorded questions that you are going to answer yourself or record yourself answering and submit them to the company. And and you're going to be doing virtual interviewing not on the company site. You'll be providing a visual image to that company, so they'll still be evaluating you as a potential candidate. Virtual interviewing can be conducted live with people on the other side, but it also could just be you talking to the camera. So there's some pros and cons to both of those in ways that you can be successful in either environment. So we'll talk about those as we move forward. Um, Common technologies that could be used for virtual interviewing, as we're all experiencing right now through our virtual spaces that we're in. Skype and FaceTime are also are resources that can be used, but GoToMeeting and Zoom, like we're using today, are very common. Adobe Connect and even YouTube Live. YouTube Live can be part of some of the technologies that are used. Pre-recorded interview questions. A lot of companies use systems like HireVue and Yellow are common, but there are other options out there, and you can do a search online and see what some of those options are. They were ones that we haven't really heard of, and they're ones that a lot of the companies that typically recruit at Embry-Riddle haven't used, but they are available. So when you get notified by a company that you're going to be doing a virtual interview, and especially if they want you to do pre-recorded questions, then they will tell you the system that they're going to use, and you can do a Google search and find out specific tips about that system, because there are some systems that will allow you to maybe frame yourself or will allow you multiple practices where others might not. So you want to be aware of that particular system's uniqueness and how you can work around it and make yourself successful in that system. Why would a company choose to use this option? Well, I would say a couple months ago, our answer would have been that it opens up interviewing to more candidates. And what do we mean by that is, in today's environment, it allows companies to continue to operate and plan for current and future hiring because they're not able to do it, like they're literally just not able to do it in person. But I would say a few months ago, what that would mean is that candidates sometimes can have restrictions on being able to take off of work and travel to a company to interview for another job. It might just be really limiting to them for whatever the reasons. And so by doing virtual interviewing, it opens up the interview to more people being able to be considered and puts less of a restriction and burden on that candidate, which makes the candidate, happier and more inclined to, like the company as well. Also, you avoid delays with travel, such as weather delays or even issues with the airplane or the travel system that's being used. So by doing a virtual interview, you've delayed that, or you've avoided that issue, and so it helps the interview to go smoother. Also, think about if you were to travel to a company, you're going to take quite a bit of time to do that, whereas a virtual interview would just be a short amount of time, and that person and the interviewer's person, the interview, the company's representatives day as well. So it's actually a win-win for both sides. It reduces cost associated with travel. So when a company sponsors you to come to their site to do interviewing, they're usually paying for air travel, they're paying for an overnight stay, they're paying for food, any expenses that you've incurred while you're there. Um, or even if you're driving, they're reimbursing you for your gas. And so they don't have to put that money out by doing a virtual interview. Also, the candidates sometimes are asked to front some of those costs, not like air travel or hotel, but maybe gas there and their own food, and then they submit a receipt to get reimbursed. Well, some candidates in certain times might not have the ability to cover that themselves, and so it's a less of a burden on the candidate that way too. So it's a win-win, so that reduces costs for both parties. It ensures an equal experience for all candidates when all candidates have a virtual interview. And then in today's environment, like I said, it allows companies just to continue to operate and plan for current and future hiring, which I think is a positive thing and gives us all something to continue to work towards, is that we can still apply for jobs and still do interviews and still get offers, and companies are going to do onboarding virtually until they can bring you in person to work on site. So virtual interviewing is really making things happen right now. So we're excited to see that it's growing. And but let's talk about what are some pros and cons with virtual interviewing. So the first one, when we talk about pre-recorded interviews, the systems are all different. So like I said, some systems will allow you to practice your answers ahead of time. Multiple times they'll let you practice recording your answers until you get it right, and then you actually hit the record button and submit button, and you know that that interview is, or that answer to that interview question is what you would want them to see. Other systems, on the other hand, give you a time limit before your answer is submitted. So it might give you 60 seconds, and then you have to record and submit your answer, whatever it is. So that's why knowing the system ahead of time and checking out the tips for using that system, or even asking your contact if they could tell you what the system allows, and if it allows you to practice or if you have restrictions, would be a good thing to know. Um, it's convenient. So as a pro, it's convenient for the company and the candidate. Um, as I already talked about, it also provides global connectivity for the candidates that are not necessarily in the same location, but also for the company to be able to consider a broad range of candidates. So global connectivity is a positive for both sides. All candidates should receive the same interview questions, and especially in the pre-recorded questions, that's going to be the same. So that's a pro. And then you can have notes in front of you, but let me just caution you, if you have notes, you don't want to be looking down and reading your answers like I just did. And you also don't want to be shuffling your papers around. Oh, where was that answer? Let me look over here. You want to use that as just a quick backup if you needed it, but you could have the notes there to help support you, but you wouldn't want to rely on them as very much at all. That's different for phone interviewing, but for virtual interviewing where you're face-to-face, you want to have that laid out so you can quickly glance at it, especially if you're doing pre-recorded interviews, but you don't want to be shuffling your papers around, so be aware of that. As far as cons or drawbacks to doing virtual interviewing, again, I mentioned you might only have one try before you record your final answer, so you want to be practicing your interview questions and answers ahead of time just so that you're more prepared. Um, the pre-recorded interviews, no one is on the other side, so there's no one to interact with. However, there's ways around that. And I would say, you know, one of my colleagues had shared that you could put a sticky note above your camera just to remind you to look at the camera on your device. I also say you could probably write smile on that so you remember to smile. But I also think that with today, our environment today, many of us have been doing virtual classes online, virtual presentations, lots of virtual meetings, and we're getting used to looking at that little dot on your device and talking to that so that you're going to be appearing to make great eye contact. And so I think that that con is going to probably be less for most people that are used to doing virtual interactions right now. The environment that you are in might not be helpful, and so that's something you can control, and Ryan's going to talk about that in just a minute. Like the lighting, the technology, body language that you're using when you're talking and interacting with the people on the other side. So you can control that and make that less of a drawback. Lack of experiencing the company culture is definitely a drawback to the virtual interview, especially if companies are going to um, actually make a hiring decision and onboard you while you're still in a remote situation. However, you can ask a lot of good questions with the people that you are interviewing and try and get a feel for what that company culture is, so that it's not, you know, different when you actually get to go on site and start working there. You can kind of get a feel for that. Um, and then the virtual interview, I would say in the past could have created a sense of being not as professional, but I think now that we're all getting used to it, we're getting used to what's expected and how to operate in a virtual environment. And that again also will be something that'll be a little bit less of a drawback. So I think this is really not as negative as it probably was a few months back, and we're getting a lot more comfortable with the virtual environment and virtual interviewing that'll go along with that. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Ryan, and he's going to talk a lot more about what are some tips for being successful in a virtual environment. Ryan?
Thank you, Sandy. Hey, everyone. I'm Ryan Mazon. I'm a program manager in career services. Happy to bring you some tips for success today. And before we really dig into that, just wanted to plug a bit. We did start, if you are on Instagram, an Instagram TV video series called Your Career Development Minute. We do touch on this briefly, along with many other subjects. So check that out if you haven't already. But like I said, I'd love to go through all these tips with you thoroughly. So starting with the environment, as Sandy was talking about, I would say you certainly have to try to do the best with what you got, especially since we don't have a lot of options nowadays. Starting with the lighting, you can use me as an example. I have a window in front of me, but I also have a lamp right here. Let's say if it was dark, I'd want it pointed right at me. And with all this being said, you know, it may feel kind of awkward and uncomfortable sometimes because we're maybe not used to literally the spotlight, but this is the time to make sure you look good, you're saying things well, including lighting, let alone how you're dressed and stuff like that. My background, as you can see, is sort of neutral. It's just, you know, white paint with a lamp in the background. I would say as long as you make it neutral, that's great. If you do have stuff in the back, make sure it's professional as well. I have a good example that sometimes I've had a diploma in the background. There's nothing really wrong with that. I think the bigger question is it distracting? Whether it's a sound, which we'll get into, but in this case, the background, is it distracting? That's what you got to ask yourself. So with sounds, that could be pets, that could be roommates. So I remember even being in college doing my first interviews, I would make sure that I'd text my roommates, whoever I was living with, days in advance, like, hey, during this time on that day, I'm going to need some quiet space. But what's great about all that is that when career services opens back up to students and alum, you can actually reserve the interview rooms that we do have if you're so interested. And that includes not only a quiet space, but some technology considerations as well that you can take advantage of. As far as the camera, like Sandy was saying, making eye contact virtually would be looking at the camera, not necessarily the screen. So just try to be aware of that. I think it's like breaking a bad habit. So just be aware of it. Like Sandy said, you could put a sticky note right next to the camera. I used to have one on my laptop that would say, look here, or smile, or whatever reminders you need kind of in your field of vision. That's been really helpful for me. I know it'd be very helpful for you. As far as distance, you wouldn't want to be too far away where it looks awkward, but you'd want to be too close either, because that's still pretty uncomfortable. I like that it says 2/3 of an arm length away. I like that because if you're more than an arm's length away, you aren't able to like adjust anything technologically if need be. And finally, with this room, there's a bookcase over there. There's a lot of stuff in it. But I have been in an empty room before. I think I had just moved in or something like that, and it does get very echoey. So with that all being said, just be mindful of audio. That's why I even wear headphones, just to avoid the risk of echo. Speaking about environment again, Sandy did also bring up taking notes. I always have a pad here to take notes on that I've already written down, such as questions that I know I want to ask the interviewer, but an opportunity to write down anything that I want to remember for later on. Like Sandy said, again, you don't want to have your head buried in it. All this to say, you would approach it just like you would an in-person interview. There is a lot of overlap there. I also keep plenty of pens nearby. When it comes to the camera as well, I have this like binder that sometimes I put the camera on to make sure it's really eye level if need be. Use what you got around you to make all that happen. When it does come to the technology, whether it's Zoom, Skype, especially if you're fairly new to the software, download it in advance, not even an hour before, but maybe the day before, to make sure the software is updated, etc., that you can check your camera, the audio. I used to call my mom before. I mean, if that's the way you practice, awesome, but you'll certainly want to call a trusted friend on said software to make sure it all works well, that it goes both ways for visual and audio. Another thing that people often overlook is going to be the Wi-Fi connection. I've literally, since I live in Florida, have checked the weather of the day that I'm going to have the interview. So if I know that if there's a thunderstorm coming in, if there's ever a thunderstorm, my Wi-Fi goes out, I'm going to try to go to another location. So Wi-Fi connection, I mean, sure, typically it's reliable, but you got to be aware of it as well when you go into these situations. And that's also why I always ask for a backup phone number so that I can call people just in case. I've had the video kind of like this working, right? But the audio completely shot. And I think it was actually the interviewer's fault due to the software, all that, right? So what we did is I called them to do the audio, and we could still see each other. So there could be a mix and match option there, but that's why it's good to not only have headphones, but a phone number in your phone with you. But speaking of your phone, you certainly don't want to necessarily have it on. I usually turn mine off. I don't know if you've ever gotten an Amber Alert, but even if you have your phone on Do Not Disturb or whatever, it'll still be very loud for good reason, because it's an Amber Alert. But that's why I just straight up turn it off unless I completely need it. So keep that in mind as well. When you are working on a device, you want to pretty much close out any other program, again, visually, so that even if it's just a pop-up window, maybe only you see it and not the interviewer. But again, it's a distraction. So mitigate that risk. And audio wise, right? Our email, for instance, it makes a large sound when we just get an email in our inbox. That's why it's good to exit out of that as well. And then due to the professional image considerations, that's why I dressed up a little bit today. It's important to, again, approach your professional image virtually just as you would in person. So I'm dressed up. I, have obviously the blazer on, dressed professionally. Definitely wear professional bottoms as well. I don't know if you all saw the viral video that went out of the interview of the newscaster where he thought the camera could only see his waist up, but you could see a little bit of the fact that he had gym shorts on. It's funny, but it could be very awkward and uncomfortable, and at the end of the day, unprofessional. So even if you're not used to wearing nice clothes anymore due to the quarantine, make sure you're completely dressed. You want to sit up straight, I've been trying to do that as much as possible, so forgive me if I haven't done all that. Lean forward a little bit. That's just the opposite of leaning back, which just makes you look a little lazy, and you'll feel that way as well. I am in a chair that I can swivel in. Don't do that. I think a lot of us have chairs that we can swivel in. Don't do it because it's a camera that is stationary, so you should be stationary as well. And with the camera, and that being said, you would want to practice with the camera. We already talked about doing a video call to someone else to prepare. A consideration of that is the camera, so you're used to, again, how far away you need to be completely framed and your head's not cut off like that. Those are all things that you want to be thinking about. We already talked about putting a sticky note of whatever reminders that you want, but that next point is going to be body language. And I talk about this in a lot of presentations that when it comes to virtual interviewing, since we can't show a lot of body language, we can show it a little bit, right, in this little frame here. But since we can't show it a lot, we want to compensate for it. So whenever I'm talking, I don't talk all with my hands constantly because, again, that's a distraction. But anytime I can emphasize a word, I lean in a little bit and I use my hand. If I say, well, let's think about X versus Y, I use my hands and I lean a little bit. All things that you can practice that can only accentuate what could be a great interview response virtually. And when it comes to those responses, you want to make sure your professional communication is still the same as if you're giving a formal speech, but obviously addressing any question professionally as well. And that includes being mindful of ums. I say the word like a lot. Just be mindful and honest about what your faux pas are, whatever they may be. And it's just another thing to practice. It's not a big deal nowadays. I don't think employers really dock points for that kind of thing unless it's constant. But I would say that you, again, should just be aware of it, and you should still try to be professional with it because even though it's a little accepted, it doesn't mean it's always okay. Going into that next point, smile, like Sandy said. I think that covers a lot of bases. Another one that covers a lot of bases is breathe. A lot of people forget to just take a second while the interviewer is asking them a question to just take a deep breath. It'll help you recollect, get your mind focused and moving, and then engaging as best as possible. This isn't just a call and response. You're not a robot trying to give the best answer. It is a conversation at the end of the day. So socially, you still want to engage with the other person on the other side of the screen. And finally, let's come full circle into that last point there. When you are starting a virtual interview or even a virtual call in general, a good tip would now be to do a digital handshake, which is a little bit of a slow, confident, professional, firm nod. Hello, how are you? Without showing the top of your head, you don't necessarily need to bow, but it's just a bit of a professional nod and with a slight shoulder bend and all that. You want to keep your eyes forward. You don't look down necessarily. But if you start implementing that, you'll find that just like the body language thing, it's kind of a visual representation of what you're trying to say outside of the verbal aspect. So I hope y'all gained something from this. Maybe you knew some of them before. Hopefully you learned something new. But with all this being said, they're all considerations in maximizing your effectiveness of being a good virtual interviewer. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks. Those are great tips, Ryan. And also last week we were part of a alumni engagement office virtual presentation, Talent Talks, and in there we talked a lot about virtual interviewing as well. There's a lot of these tips that we shared in there as well, and also tips about speaking and making sure that you're not pausing. And another tip that was shared during that time is if you do have to pause to think, make sure you acknowledge that to the interviewers and say, you know, that's a really good question. Give me just a moment to think about it, because otherwise every second that you're pausing within a virtual interview environment can feel really exaggerated. So you want to make sure that you address that. And that's something that we talked about last week in that, that presentation. So great tips, Ryan. Thank you so much for covering that. Okay, so quickly, I'm just going to share a couple of pictures here, and I want to point out a few things based on what Ryan just shared with us that have kind of stood out to me in these two images. The image on the left is with the two guys, and one is on the screen and one is sitting on the at the table. At first glance, you think, oh, this looks really good. But I would say, based on what we just talked about, a few things stand out to me about this image where you can control this and you can make it better. So first of all, the person on the screen, he is wearing a long sleeve dress, button-up dress shirt, but it's also not buttoned at the collar, at the top, and he is not wearing a tie or a suit jacket. And his collar is like laying down. So it's a lot less professional than if it was up. And so it makes his shirt come off um, a little more messy, not so neat and clean like the guy sitting in the chair. They both could be wearing a suit jacket, which would make the environment a lot better. Also, look at his body language, the person on the screen. While he is sitting up and his hand is leaning forward, he's also not necessarily leaning forward a little bit, unlike the person on the right who is. So that could put a little bit of distance in the perspective of the person doing the interviewing, and might not come across as he is that interested. And this is all visual, and it's a visual evaluation, but visual is very important in the virtual environment. So you want to make sure you're aware of how you're coming across over the screen. On the right side, the two pictures there, the things that stand out to me, yes, the bigger picture, the person is not wearing a suit jacket, unlike the smaller picture of the person who is wearing the suit jacket. But even without the suit jacket, his shirt, the camera's closer, so his shirt comes off neater, pressed, his collar is up, and so therefore it does look a little bit more professional. Also, he's making really good eye contact with the camera, and that really comes through in this picture, whereas in the other picture, that person's a little further away from the camera, and so it just doesn't come across the same. Also there, the person on the right, he has some background there, which is kind of interesting. And depending on what it is, I hope it's intentional, it would give him maybe an opportunity to reference what's there, or it could be something that he's planned ahead of time and written out or drawn out, where he could share that in the interview. So he would be intentional about that background. Where the background on the left, while there's nothing distracting, it's also nothing that's interesting either. It's a little plain, and so you want to kind of think about that when you're planning your environment and your background. This is a link to our career spots video, and you can find those in the on the career services career management system called Handshake, or even on the Career Services Office website. And there's a particular one for online video interviewing that you can watch. It's about 2 minutes or so. So I think that if you want to watch that, you can go find that, or if you find this recording, you can grab that link and you can watch it on your own. So it's got some good tips, but a lot of the stuff that we've already covered today. Now, we reached out to some employers, and we got a little bit of feedback from them on what makes a good virtual interview. And while I would say right now we don't really have a lot of choice in how we interview, you want to be aware of how you can make your interview the best. And so some of the things that stood out to the employers we reached out to that made an interview a good interview would be enthusiastic candidates that smile at the camera. Smiling appropriately at the right time, obviously, but that you smile at the camera. And that makes good eye contact, body language leaning forward, as Ryan already talked about, and just shows that you're engaging with the people on the other side. Engage the recruiters by telling a story when you're answering a question. But this is basic interview 101. You want to do that anyways. So make sure that you are doing that, whether it's virtual or face-to-face or phone interviewing. But that made the interview stand out, even whether it was virtual or not, that the candidates are dressed professionally. In today's world, interviewers ask interesting questions, and depending on what environment or type of job you're applying to and interviewing for, you might need to stand up and do a presentation. In those situations, you want to make sure you are fully dressed. I would say, regardless of the environment you're in, if you have an opportunity to interview virtually, you need to be dressed fully. It changes your mindset. And so That's what stood out in a good interview, is that that recruiter or that the interviewee was dressed appropriately for the interview, that the background and environment is appropriate for the interview, just like Ryan's already talked about, that your answers are concise and appropriate to the questions, meaning you're listening, you're paying attention, and you're responding appropriately. And that made the interview a good interview. And that practiced answers to typical, you want to practice answers to typical interview questions. You don't want to be caught off guard, and be able to communicate what's on your resume. That made the interview good. Now, what made the interview not so good? And I would say what they shared with us was that candidates talked endlessly and without, having an end to their questions, and their interviewers were like, what did I even ask them? I forget now, we talk so long. So you want to be aware of your time limits, even if they're unsaid for interview questions, especially if you're pre-recording. But if you're not, be aware of what's a standard time limit for a question, and make sure you've practiced your answers to stay within that environment or that time frame. Awkwardly placed cameras could make an interview not so good. So I'm just going to leave that just like that. Distractions during the interview, as Ryan's already talked about, but this was employer feedback supporting that those tips that Ryan shared were actually on point. That the candidates were unprepared for questions that they were asked. Practice, practice, practice. An unprofessional image during the interview. So I would say if you look at those things that made the interview not so good, those are things you can control. You can make those things not happen so that your interview can have that much more likely to be a very successful and a good interview. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Valerie, and she's going to talk with us about big interview.
Thank you so much, Sandy. So now that we've discussed a lot about how to be successful in an interview, how do we practice this? And so Career Services has recently had the opportunity to acquire some new software called Big Interview. And this is an online system that combines training and practice to help you work and improve upon your interview skills. So to get to Big Interview, you need to go to eru.biginterview.com, click register, and you do need to use your Embry-Riddle email address. Even if you're an alum, you do need to use your Embry-Riddle one because it has that ERU at the end. Enter your name, your password, and create your account. Very easy. Once you're in, there's many different resources for you to work on your interviewing skills. First, it will take you to the Learn section. There's a Fast Track Learning and then a Mastery track. The Fast Track Learning has 16 different videos that allows you to learn all the different components of interviewing. Next, you would go to the Practice section. And the first practice section is just general interview questions. You can also do interview questions based on different industry as well. And there's over 1,000 questions in this system. When you do click on general interviews and want to do a practice interview, you need to make sure that your camera and microphone are connected and accessible to Big Interview. Also, the interviewer will give you the question. They'll say it because it's part of a little video, and then it'll give you a countdown, 3, 2, 1, and you can answer the question. There's a tips button as well that will give you some tips or insights into answering that question if you're not sure what to do. And once you do record your answer, you can re-record or save it. There's also an interview roulette section, which will give you 20 random questions that you can practice. So this is maybe for a little more confident interviewer. If you know what you're doing, you just really want to test your skills, 20 random questions that you can just answer right there. There's also an answer builder, and this helps you with building a behavioral question answer. So those tell me about a time questions, it will help walk you through those steps of building an answer. And then finally, a question library, where there's just, again, over 1,000 questions that you can practice and get some tips and insight into answering those. Once you record a video, it's housed in the My Videos section, and you can access it there. You can actually send your videos for other people to review for you, such as career services professionals, family, friends, faculty, and they don't need to have a Big Interview account. They can just review your video and give you feedback. There's also a resume curriculum portion of Big Interview. So if you don't have a resume, I would encourage you to use Career Services website, careerservices.erau.edu, to look at different resources. But there's also a part of Big Interview where you can actually sit down and write in all of your experience, skills, and etc., and it will create a resume for you. And there's videos that go along with that. So Big Interview is a great way to practice your digital or virtual interviews because it's all online. And so I would encourage you to check out this great news. So we'll go to the next slide, and we want to make sure that you do stay connected with our office during this time. So of course, like I mentioned, we have our website, careerservices.erau.edu. We have tons of resources on there for you. Hopefully you all are a part of Handshake and have already activated your Handshake account. That's our career management system. We're on Ernie. We have a My Team site through there. Make sure you like us, follow us, tweet us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We also have a LinkedIn page that you can join. And then we also have our blog. Our blog is on our Career Services website. And then we also have our Going Places podcast hosted by Mr. Ryan Maison. And I did see a question come in. Yes, alumni are able to use Big Interview. You just need your Embry-Riddle email address. If you don't know that, you can contact our office and we can get that for you for sure.
By email.
And then yes.
Yes.
And then finally, we have our new YouTube channel. And so we ask for you to find our site. Right now, if you just go to YouTube, type in Daytona Beach Career Services, it will bring you to our YouTube site. All of our previous recordings that we've done, such as this, we have one specifically for Big Interview and a couple of other resources. It will actually walk you through the site so you can see how to use it. But definitely check out our YouTube channel. This presentation will be on the YouTube channel as well. So if you need to reference it, feel free. So now we are going to open it up to questions. Please, if you would like to show your face and ask us verbal questions, we're happy to do that. Answer them as well as any chat questions.
Also, Valerie, while we're waiting for people to ask us questions, I did want to share that we came across an article from LinkedIn that talked about virtual interviewing, and some of the questions that they mentioned in there were about the time that what you did with your time right now during this environment that we're in right now. And I think that's really good because we didn't really talk a lot about the types of questions that you would be asked in the interview, because really those questions should be similar to what you would get in a face-to-face interview. But you do want to think about how you've been spending your time during the environment where you've been in a virtual or remote situation, because companies could ask you about that, especially if they're considering onboarding you remotely and making sure that you have the ability to work remotely for a while if needed. So make sure that you maybe look for that article on LinkedIn about virtual interviewing with some really good tips and questions that you should think about how you would answer if asked by a company right now. So I just wanted to share that.
I think that's a great point. Do all these companies have remote opportunities for people? I'll give an example that my sister actually is transitioning to a new job. She did the interview online. She never actually met anyone face to face, but is actually starting her onboarding and everything remote because she's still in lockdown in her state. So it's happening and people are hiring. So it's great that that's still the opportunity. But like Sandy said, have you been doing any certifications? Are you doing anything professionally to help you develop? If you're not currently in a position, how are you using this time effectively?
Yeah. And even one of them was, do you have a dedicated space that you would be able to work remotely in? Do you really have the ability to work remotely? And so I know a lot of us have been forced into a remote environment where we maybe didn't have a dedicated space and we've created one. But if you really like the idea of working remotely, you want to make sure you've got a space that's going to support that. So just some things to think about that we wouldn't maybe have thought about before, since a lot of companies wouldn't usually start people off remotely if they've never worked remotely before. But I think that this environment we're in, we can take a positive from that and say that we have experienced a remote environment. We've learned, kind of worked out some of the kinks on what that would be like if we had to work completely from home because of maybe the type of job we were applying to, or whatever the situation, happens, in the next coming months. So just some
We do
things to
have
think about. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. We do have a question that came in from owner. It says, how would you apply or ask for interviews with companies that are not posting positions?
So I think in that's just really across the board, like anytime, whether it's the environment we're in right now or not, if you have an interest in a company, then you would reach out to whatever contact you might have, whether it was an alum that was working there, the HR, contact us email, finding a contact through LinkedIn, and reaching out. And you don't want to just ask for an interview right away, obviously. You want to ask about certain questions, or let's just say it's a student, they're looking for an internship and the company doesn't currently offer internship postings. Then you might inquire, do you have an internship program in typical times? Do you have an internship program? How can I learn more about that? Start that conversation. I have noticed that your company has recruited for these type of positions, but I'm specifically interested in user experience, and I know that the product you're working on would probably have that involved. Do you ever post positions for user experience, or whatever it might be that your interest is? You have to kind of start with questions, and hopefully that leads to future conversation with them, or connecting through LinkedIn, connecting with other people that work there, for them to get to know you a little bit more, and seeing that you would have a unique offering for that company, and then they would then be interested in you and hopefully like forward your name on to a manager of a certain department or something like that. So it's not an exact answer about how would you apply or ask for interviews when a company's not posting positions. I think that if they don't say, hey, if you're interested in working for us, submit your resume. We're for no particular positions, just submit your resume. A lot of these new startups do that. But if a lot of companies might not be doing that. You might just have to kind of wait and start networking at this point. Would you guys have any other suggestions?
Yeah, I would also suggest maybe you do an informational interview with them, and it could be via one of these platforms. So you get to see the person, you get to talk with them as if it was a face-to-face informational interview to learn more about the person, maybe more about the company, have any advice, and maybe that person becomes your mentor. You develop a relationship with them. So, again, if they're not currently seeking anyone for a position, it's all about getting to know them, getting to know the company at this time. Because it will hopefully turn around.
Yeah, things will turn around, and they'll need to hire again, and that you'll already have reached out and put the work in. Yep, and they'll look to you first. So definitely about networking connections right now. Good point, Valerie. Okay, anybody else have any questions for us about virtual interviewing? No? Well, we thank you so much for joining us today. We hope we've been able to share some tips that will help you to be better prepared for the virtual interviewing that you might be doing here coming soon. So if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Career Services office, and we will definitely try to assist you. This presentation will be uploaded to YouTube, so you can go back and look at the presentation again. And please look forward to, or definitely please look for other opportunities that we're going to be giving presentations on coming soon, and you'll find all of those when we post them in Handshake. You'll find them in there. There's lots of events coming up that are in virtual environments, so definitely check them out. Join us again in the future, and have a great day.
Thank you.